So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted that we have quite a sizable audience for the 7th of May, because tomorrow obviously is a holiday, an important day. But I'm delighted that we still can be here in such numbers and discuss the topic of space security. My name is Jana. I currently serve as a senior fellow at the Prague Security Studies Institute, but until recently I served as space policy officer at the European Union at their European External Action Service, which is the foreign policy and security arm of the European Union, and I dealt with space issues, mainly security aspects of the big European programs, Galileo, Copernicus, as well as the international dimensions of the EU activities in space. And previously I served at the European Space Policy Institute, which is located in Vienna, where I was seconded from the European Space Agency, which is an intergovernmental European organization that puts together European states dealing with space activities. Today, my topic is space security and its bilateral and international dimensions. So if I may, I will give you a brief overview of what I decided to discuss. It will be first an overview of the space security environment, because from what I understood from the last lectures, I think it's good to talk about why today we talked about space security, because it's not a new topic. So why is it important today more than it was during the Cold War, for example? And what are the different aspects of it than they used to be before? Then I will focus on what is the international space security discourse. Why am I saying discourse? Because I'm going to look at the diplomatic venues and what is the discussions there versus some of the realities that the space operators and actors are facing. And specifically, I'm going to focus on what China and Russia do in the international venues vis-a-vis space security efforts, and let's say the other side, the EU, the European countries, and for that matter, United States and Japan, and how they view how the space security should look like and the future of it. And then I will look at some of what I think is going to be discussed in the foreseeable future. So perhaps we can start with why is the environment in space changing and what are the security aspects of it. So I think you hear this now more and more, that there is growing dependence on space globally. I think that has been the truth for some time, but I think it's every day it's more and more acute that we cannot live without satellites. So for example, telecommunications, we have in aviation, pilots obviously rely on telecommunications, otherwise they could not talk to air traffic controls. If we look at container ships in remote areas or aid workers in remote areas all over the world, they depend on the world communications. For example, if we don't have satellites, we still can use the internet probably, but we might not be able to make international phone calls. In short, I think for most of us, without the telecommunications, our world would not only slow down, but it would probably fall apart. There's obviously a lot emphasized dimension of space activities, and that's the social and economic development. This is emphasized a lot, for example, by the European countries and European Union. We have a global dependence on the position and navigation systems. For example, complex financial transactions depend on the PNT systems, where we look at seconds for whether we make millions or lose millions. All computer-run systems, for example, water treatment system, traffic lights, railway systems, they all depend on GPS. So this is something that is what what we now like to call strategic infrastructure, and space enables a lot of these activities. Weather forecasts, we depend on satellites on meteorological satellites. It's not only, aviation industry, but it's also disaster and environmental management. We could not live without that. When we talk about disaster management, we also rely heavily on Earth observation satellites. We have an image here of hurricane monitoring, which obviously is only one example of many floods and other volcano eruptions and others that we are able to monitor in near real time with the Earth observation satellites. And the disaster management manages these in all phases. That means we use communications when disaster happens to aid workers on the ground. They use communications. Earth observation satellites deal with monitoring the situation and also after the fact assessing what is the damage, what is the follow-up. So these, the advantage of the Earth observation satellites is that they do it in near real time. The communication satellite, again, position location, distress alerting, coordination relief operations, these are all things that are enabled by satellites. So again, I think every activity would be severely disrupted without space systems. So what I here put also beside the image of the hurricane, I put the SES-2 satellite of the Luxembourg-based company SES, which manages 54 geostationary satellites. So they are the largest operator of geostationary satellites. So I thought that is an interesting, because a small country like Luxembourg has been able to dominate the geo belt with their commercial services. And below that, there is a Earth observation image of 2 dates from 7th of February and 23rd of March of the runway construction by Jana at the Fiery Cross Reef in the Spratly Islands. So you can see that this is an example of, we can read in today's newspaper, a real image of an activity of a country that can have a large geopolitical impact. So this also is enabled by satellites. Now, let's see. Now, why is the environment also changing? So you can see in the graph, this was an image which is now old, kind of old, few years, from the National Security Space Strategy of the United States, how the activities have increased dramatically. So now we have over 60 governmental and private consortia operating in space. So this is versus 2 countries during the Cold War. So in the past 2 decades, we had a dramatic increase of operations in space. And also, what we have here, I have put some of the images of logos of the commercial companies in space operating. This is something I think quite unprecedented in the arena. We have a large number of commercial operators. So there are 2 dimensions of it. So first of all, it's becoming a strategic sector for increasing amount of governments, but at the same time, there's increasing number of commercial operators that want to engage in space activities and are increasingly successful. This is also given by the fact that the policies of the countries have evolved positively in this direction, because, for example, during the Obama administration, has created a great opening of an entry of commercial companies to government to aid government activities, and of course for example, with the funding that comes with it. I also added a bit of a futuristic image of an asteroid deflection possibility, which is of course a big discussion. But there is, for example, this B12 Foundation, which was founded by 2 astronauts, and they are looking into ways how perhaps in the future the humankind will have to face this kind of scenarios, and how this can be dealt with. So what is, I think, also interesting about space sector is that unlike other sectors, it's not affected by the economy that quickly. Why is that? Because space is a national imperative, and if states decide to invest in space, these are usually longer-term programs, because the procurement and development and launch and operation of a satellite program usually lasts years, because if we look at a regular, let's say, telecommunication satellite, it can be up 10 to 15 years in space. And to develop that satellite takes also years, notwithstanding the fact that you have to book your orbital assignments with the ITU, with the International Telecommunications Union, years in advance. So there are a lot of dimensions why the sector is more stable, let's say, than others. Also, there is increasing commercial dimensions. The applications that come from these satellites are today a multi-billion dollar industry. So this is especially the truth with telecommunications, but I think increasingly other sectors are also developing faster. So, of course, the large costs that are connected with it is also with that is the problem of the governments, because not all governments are continuously willing to spend money for these kind of activities. So, you know, the Apollo program, if you look at the budget of the OMB, of the US Apollo program, the curve went like this, you know, so suddenly the investments in space were huge and the results were huge. Today, a lot of the countries are facing problems like, are we investing, you know, what are we going to fund? Do we have to fund other activities, environmental disasters? How do we manage other things, you know, increasing number of human beings on this planet versus let's invest in a huge moon program? You know, these are, I think, big questions that the governments have to face vis-a-vis their taxpayers. So that's where the commercial companies come in, and the private enthusiasts that are willing to spend some money. So increasingly there is an opening for the commercial side to join in. But also with the private companies coming to space, there are big questions of, let's say, liability. I think you may have heard in October there were 2 big incidents with the unmanned launch rocket Antares, which blew up during launch, which was unexpected a little bit, a big disaster. And also the Virgin Galactic spacecraft 2 had an accident where pilot also died. These are all unprecedented things that now the government has to deal with, because all activities in space are regulated by governments, and governments are today responsible for all commercial activities. And this is not, the United States has gone, I think, the farthest in regulating these activities, but increasingly other countries are also want to join in space doing this. So there are all these big questions that will have to be solved in terms of regulatory aspects and the liability issues, notwithstanding the human risks, because you hear a lot about tourism, space tourism. It's a wonderful thing, but today, you know, astronauts is a human. It's a human envoy, an envoy of humankind, and every country that sends an astronaut is responsible for him. So let's say, you know, we send a space tourist, we have to have a different definition, I think, of an astronaut as a tourist versus an astronaut as an envoy of humankind. So these are all questions that are now being looked at by governments. So again, I think that the private sector is going to grow because there are obviously individuals such as Elon Musk and Richard Branson that are willing to invest a lot in space, because, and that I think is a good sign, because it seems that there is some kind of profit behind it, and also looking into the, looking good for the future of the space activities. So again, though, it's costly, there are large technical risks, and it requires large user markets. So, although, the commercial will continue to grow, for now, the governments are still the biggest investors in space activities, and that comes with it, a large part of it is for defense-related purposes, because that's a strategic sector that governments will continue to invest in, because the good things about, I think it's good things about space technologies, they're dual use. That means you develop the same kind of technology and it can be used for commercial activities, but it can also be used for military activities. So there are dedicated military technologies, obviously, and the major space powers have them. But increasingly, we can look into commercial technologies that can be used for defense and military activities in space. And this is, I think, is also very tough thing for the political dimension of the discussions, as we'll get into in a minute. I don't have a clock here, so I better, because just warn me if I'm talking too long in one slide. Again, as I discussed, growing competitiveness in the space market, and that also pertains to countries. We've got sizable budget increases for space, unprecedented. For example, countries like Brazil doubled their space budget in 2012. So that shows you that, for example, that increasingly even these developing countries see this as a strategic sector. I have created this table some time ago where I look at the Asia-Pacific regions, because, for example, besides China, which I will mention as a very prominent country in that aspect, but for example, also India. India used to look at space technologies from the dimension of how can we help our sizable population, how do we look into the water management and so forth. But more recently, India is looking into dedicated defense capabilities in space. Of course, this is also influenced heavily by China, China's development of space capabilities. But for example, they have invested in dedicated military telecommunication satellites. They're developing their GPS augmentation system. They're looking into user radar imaging satellites. So these are all expensive technologies that India was able to promote in their budget with their population, and also build that. So I think these are very important developments. And that brings me back that it's still the governments who are the major investors in the research and development of new technologies. When we mentioned the budgetary side, I have read in this OECD booklet, which they always assess the economy of space, and they said that in 2013 the global space activities grew to $314 billion. So that's quite a sizable, I think, industry, even if it's a niche sector. So if we look at the, actually this I already mentioned. So if you go back to, I think, China, which I have here, the China is obviously an example of a country that has invested in all dimensions of space activities, and that's very expensive. But when we look at their budget, for example, in between 2000 and 2007, China has increased twofold their defense budget. And if you look at the space budget, that has witnessed a lot of that development simultaneously. So you can see that although China has done a lot of strides in the human dimension of, let's say, space activity, human space flight. They have invested in lunar orbiter and others. They have also invested heavily in other dual-use technologies. So I think this is something to follow and watch, because I think there's going to be, I think, developments that will, I think, react also to geopolitical sides, and I think China has made a big progress on that side. So besides China and their, Shenzhou and Chang'e missions, and we have, India's also had developed a lunar orbiter, but also Japan, for example. Japan have their own launch capabilities, which is a strategic part of space. Access to space is key. And as you know, Europe is, for example, right now facing a big question. How are they going to ensure access to space? And it's a big discussion in the European Space Agency. Not only vis-a-vis the human space flight, but also future of launch of their own satellites. But other countries, for example, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Taiwan, they're all looking into developing indigenous capabilities. And I think that's a big change, because a lot of these countries have acquired capabilities. They have made the satellites from other countries and just simply purchase it and just operate it. But that's not the case anymore. Countries want to develop their indigenous technologies to be able to develop their own capabilities. Now, space debris. That's another aspect that is big in the discussions also. What the United States called increasing congestion in space. The congestion covers space debris, but also large radio frequency spectrum demand. This is also a large issue for operators. But I'm gonna look into the debris aspect, because this is something that is troubling both militaries, but also civilian operators, commercial operators. So they're all in the same boat vis-a-vis space debris, because the space debris does not choose whether it's going to hit a military or commercial or private satellite. It doesn't care. It doesn't discriminate. So that's a big problem for everyone, especially in the low Earth orbit, where there's a large number of satellites, but also increasingly in the geostationary orbit. And it's a problem not only from a debris themselves, but also from the matter of management of the satellites. So currently, the United States tracks debris through the so-called Space Surveillance Network, which is a network of mainly ground-based, but they also now have a space-based sensors, and they monitor this debris, about 22,000 trackable debris. But then when you look at this little table, you've got 500,000 at least of 1 to 10 centimeters, and over 100 million and probably more of debris that are smaller than 1 centimeters. And these can also cause issues, but the big focus is on those larger than 10 centimeters, because they can, for example, create a big problems for the international space stations, which today has to move about once a month to avoid a debris, which is a big problem in terms of the fuel consumption and viability of that space station. So this is a topic that is being discussed in all international venues, I think, and this I wanted to just. There's a U.S. example of the baseball size, but I mean I think we can get a sense of the size. So when we talk about threat, what are we talking about? We're not talking about weapons in space, obviously. I'm going to talk about weapons in space. What does that mean or does not mean? But what are we actually facing? So we are facing a large number of natural hazards. We've got space weather issues. There are large, and of course space weather itself can discard functionality of satellites on itself. Meteorites, so-called nearest object. Okay, this is probably not a topic of the future decades, but maybe in 100 years, you know, we might have an issue. So I think this is also something that, for example, NASA is looking into, tracking, you know, different asteroids that could potentially impact or have a close flyby with Earth. We've got also man-made issues, and besides the space debris which is created by humans, because every space mission creates debris, every launch creates a debris today, we've got other issues like the radio frequency interference. Now the big discussion is, for example, how much radio frequency spectrum should be dedicated to terrestrial operators like mobile operators versus satellites. We've got Earth observation satellites that have a huge mission within the disaster and other management. So these are today competing for the radio frequency spectrum. And then we've got, of course, potential intentional issues. Rockets, land-based rockets. I think today, besides, we've got, of course, the famous 2007 test by China, which destroyed its own old weather satellite. That's one dimension. We've got also potential cyber attack. There is a link between cybersecurity and space security. They're not the same issues, but there's an interlinkage of them, because obviously satellites don't operate on their own. They are operated from ground stations, and these ground stations obviously could be exploited by different actors in this manner. And we've got, you know, jamming and spoofing of the satellite links and others. So, for example, when we go back, I have put an image of the there's an image of the Iridium-33 and Cosmos 2251 collision in 2009. Why is that there? Well, it's reportedly the first collision of full satellites that had happened in orbit. The Cosmos at that time was not functioning. It was just floating there, apparently. And the Iridium-33 was still obviously functioning. And the path was, they intercepted on their paths. And they were monitored. Iridium was obviously monitored, but the Cosmos satellite was also monitored. But there was only predicted close approach. But obviously it was not a close approach, but it created a large number of debris. And below is the 2007 direct ASAT test by China, which I mentioned. And that has created a large problem because it was intercepted in about 870 kilometers, which is close, it's a medium Earth orbit, which means that the debris that was created will stay there for about a century and beyond. So that can now impact a large number of operators, mainly the position and navigation timing satellite, GPS, but also other, you know, weather satellites and other. And that has been seen as very irresponsible by the international community. But again, the question is what will be the responses to such actions? Because if you destroy your own satellites, well, it's your space object, you know, so, well, you know, what can you do? And obviously you're not supposed to do that based on the Outer Space Treaty, but also what is the remedy against that? And as a comparison, I'm going to use an example. For example, in 1985, the United States has intercepted its own satellites, old dysfunctioning satellite as well. But it was done in a responsible manner, because that was done, they have intercepted it in low Earth orbit. So most of the debris has been burned in the atmosphere, and most of the debris basically disappeared in 17 years. So you've got 17 years versus 100 years and more. So there are ways how to behave responsibly, I think, in space. Oh, and on the right, I have put, this was just an example of a hypothetical scenario that has been discussed recently at a planetary defense conference in March of this year. And they have looked into potential asteroid path during the Earth. And I think it's visible pretty here that I think it would be a catastrophic episode, I think, for the whole globe if it happened, because it's basically covering most of the surface, and I mean, the prediction of where it would hit is pretty difficult. So I think, but again, this is just a hypothetical scenario. This was just to show that these are also issues that are being looked at by the technical community mostly. Now, this is it looks a little boring, this slide, but I wanted to cover in one slide for the future users, because this PowerPoint is going to be on our website, so whoever is interested, they can go into details in what is actually happening in the discussions on the space security. So we've got some important venues from that perspective. We've got the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which is the UN COPUS on the first. We've got some discussions there. We've got discussions in the UN General Assembly First Committee. This is mainly discussion on transparency and confidence building measures. And we've got also discussions in the International Telecommunications Union, which looks at, regulates the radio frequency spectrum and satellite operational positions. But there are also other efforts which are outside the United Nations framework, and this is notably the EU proposal for an international code of conduct for outer space activities. Increasingly, also discussion on so-called space situational awareness. That's a very hard thing to achieve, and there is a comprehensive awareness capability by the United States, but other countries, obviously, Russia, for example, have a capability. China has some capability, but still, it's seen as not enough for monitoring objects in space and how they interact. There is, for example, also a commercial effort, because there is a so-called Space Data Association. This is an association by commercial telecommunications operators, which decided that the information that is provided by the United Space Surveillance Network is not enough for them to monitor their commercial satellites, and they have created association and voluntarily share data on their satellites and in order to avoid potential collision. And this is, I think, very important, because it's the commercial side that is pressing the governments to look into this matter in a more comprehensive way, because it's seen like the governments are not doing enough to protect their satellites. I think this is an important example. There are also increasingly so-called space traffic management discussions. What is space traffic management? Well, there's no single definition of that, but for example, the International Association of Astronautics has done a study on it in 2006. Which provided a definition of space traffic management, and they're basically saying that they're all technical and regulatory aspects of space activities that deal with access to, operation in, and the deorbiting side of space activities. So it's a large scope, I think, but they're now looking into a follow-up of that study. And more recently, for example, in the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Use of Outer Space, their legal subcommittee has adopted space traffic management as a topic for the next committee next year. So that's a big development, because the legal subcommittee usually works very slowly. So adoption of a new topic, I think, is a big deal. The bottom line is that there is no single institutional venue that deals with all aspects. And that creates a lot of terminology, a lot of definition, and a lot of different understanding of what space security is. And this continues today, I think, that there is no single definition of space security. But I think that there are better definitions and better approaches, and that there are those that are less comprehensive, so to speak. So I think I would like to look at some of the those that are kind of the two major perspectives. Okay, I will skip over this because this is too detailed. But we've got the responsible behavior perspective, which I call. So this is more, I think, aligned with what the United States is looking at, what the Europe is looking at, countries like Japan and others, where they think that space security is not about weapons in space only, but it's about all aspects of space activities. Because, as we discussed, for example, the issue of space debris is relevant to commercial and civil operators as well as to military. So these are, for example, I used an example of the space debris mitigation guidelines. These guidelines were developed by space agencies, by major space agencies in 2002. They adopted a document that said, this is what you should do if you go to space. And these are the guidelines, how you should behave if you actually procure a satellite. If you build it, you already build in measures that will help debris mitigation. And if you operate, there are also ways how to do it responsibly. And these measures were later adopted in 2000 by the UN Committee on the Peace with Outer Space and by the General Assembly of the UN in 2008. Well, what does it tell us? There's a long time lease on this. If you think that agencies came up with this in 2002, it took another years to discuss it on a diplomatic level, and finally in 2008 it was adopted, and before the technical side. So we've got 10-15 years that you've got this one aspect of space security which is discussed. So we've got a big problem because the space activities are developing much faster today, and we don't have decades to discuss the security aspect. We've got other major development, the so-called report by the group of governmental experts on transparency and confidence building in outer space activities. Why is this report important? There was a similar report in 1994, but it was not a consensus report. This report was important because this was a report that was adopted by consensus. And this was done by 15 experts from a geographically wide area of countries. But the important part is that the United States was in, Russia was in, and they were able to get a consensus on that kind of document. So what does that tell us? That these countries were able to agree that transparency and confidence building measures are important. The question is, what kind of transparency and confidence building measures are they? And this is a big discussion. And these are, for example, discussed also in the UN COPUS. There is a working group on so-called long-term sustainability in outer space activities, and they're looking into technical aspects of these measures, what they should be. And we've got then the EU initiative, the Code of Conduct, which I will mention later, and that they're also looking into various transparency and confidence building measures. Now we've got then the arms control perspective. I don't know if any of you are experts on arms control, but they're very tricky. Very tricky aspects of international, let's say, dealing with arms control. There's a lot of frustration that come with it. We can only, for example, we can look into the arms control agreement, the conventional arms control, nuclear arms control agreement. There are a lot of frustrations connected with these. Well, so for space, ideally, I would say this is not an easy baseline to deal with. But we've got so-called PAROS initiative. This is the abbreviation of Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. This is an initiative that is promoted by China and Russia in the Conference of Disarmament for now a long time, since the 1980s. And also we've got the proposal for a treaty, arms control treaty, which is also promoted by China and Russia. And Russia is also now actively promoting a concept of so-called no first placement of weapons in outer space. Which doesn't mean they wouldn't be the second. They're just saying we're not going to be the first, but we might be the second. So this is what they're actually saying in international venues. So I don't know whether that helps arms control, but this is something we can debate. So when we go in more detail on the Russia's initiative, they, as I said, they promote this concept of Paros. This is already going on since 1980s. But it has picked up recently. So in the 2008, there was the first proposal of a draft treaty of prevention of placement of weapons in outer space. The treaty was revised and a new proposal was put forward in 2014. I don't want to go in too much details in what changed, but the bottom line is that the US doesn't like it and a lot of other countries don't like it either. And the reason I will look into the reasons in my next slide, but they're not comprehensive. We've got space legal, international legal arrangement. We've got outer space treaty. We've got 3 other relevant treaties, and they're all very comprehensive. This proposed treaty has a lot of issues that other countries are not comfortable with. And again, the Russia's no first placement. So what are the shortcomings, or we could say flaws, of this PPWT proposals? For example, they offer definitions. Definitions are a tricky issue. For example, the Outer Space Treaty does not have any reference list. The Outer Space Treaty does not define what is space object. It doesn't define what is satellite. It's basically written in a way that all countries can live with and still behave in a certain way in space. The PPWT does have definitions, but with definitions, there come different issues. I mean, I will look into some of them. For example, in the 2008 version, the PPWT offered a definition of outer space. Well, that is a term that has not been agreed at the United Nations since the inception of space activities. So Russia and China came up and said, well, we define space as above 100 kilometers above the Earth's surface. Well, okay, that has not been agreed upon. And what do we do about suborbital activities, for example? All the tourist activities in space, a lot of them are supposed to be done in suborbital heights, so to speak. And so I think a lot of countries were not comfortable with this. So this was left out in the 2014 proposals. But we've got also definition of outer space object, okay, fine. We've got definition of weapon in outer space, and that's also a tricky issue, because what is a weapon in outer space? Any object in outer space could be a weapon, theoretically, if you maneuver it in the right way. Any satellite could be a weapon. But what they are saying is that we're not looking at the, we're looking at the, not at the target, but at the deployment. So we're only looking, we're only looking at the deployment of weapons. So you can develop them, store them, test them. Well, but you can't use them, but well, if there is an international crisis, I don't know, I mean, if you have the weapons, are you sure you're going to just store them and you're not going to use them? So I think this is one aspect of a big issue with that treaty. It has left out the development, testing, and deployment. It just left the term use. Okay, we can't use weapons in space. Well, okay, that's all fine, but what about all the other aspects? Another problem, it doesn't look at the, it just looks weapons in space, so it left out all terrestrial base ASAT systems, for example. So also another issue, use of force and threat of force. So what does that mean, use of force and threat of force? For example, if I'm developing and missile defense capability, is that a threat of force or not? I mean, this is not defined. So that these are problems that are created by this issue. The treaty does recognize at the same time the right of self-defense. So how do you reconcile a threat of force and on one side, and on the other side the ability to exercise the right of self-defense? And these are issues that have not been actually dealt with. So obviously by the United States it seems as neither equitable and nor effectively verifiable. That's their official line, and I think that's a pretty good summary of what they don't like about this. I think I will go further. If you have any then questions, we can go back to that, but it's a basically, I think, the summary of what is the issue. And then we've got the EU engagement on space security. You know, very new development, but why did the EU came up with an instrument? Well, first it was European countries that originally initiated this, and the European Union, you know, took this initiative and now is doing it with that. I will skip, I think, this slide. This is looking that the EU is dealing in space security also on a bilateral basis with key partners, for example, United States and Japan. But I think I will continue with the international aspect, and we can go back to that if we have time. But the point is that this proposal for the code of conduct in outer space activities came when there was some kind of vacuum in space, because we've got outer space treaties, and then there was the 2000 ASAT test, and the international community said, now, well, but you know, what do we do about things like that? I mean, there's a country that behaved irresponsibly in space, but it didn't violate per se, or it's debatable whether it violated an international regime in space. Well, it did, but was there any repercussions? Well, not really. I mean, there were a few statements by countries like the United States, but that was it. So the international community said, well, what are we going to do? And nobody came up with a new treaty, and then the EU said, well, we will. The European states came out and said, well, but we should then focus on responsible norms of behavior. Why? They're maybe easier to agree upon than treaty, and basically the treaties themselves need to be recalled. So I think the code of conduct has two purposes. One is to say, hey, states who are operating space, we have outer space treaties, and you should follow what is written in these international agreements. Secondly, they expand upon some of the aspects of the treaties. For example, the code proposed the so-called pre-launch notifications, which are not covered currently by a space treaty, but of course, in its own right, it's a controversial topic, but pre-launch notifications would be a very good confidence-building measures. Although some of them are covered in the Hague Code of Conduct against ballistic missile against the ballistic missiles, but not all space actors are part of that Hague Code. So the Code of Conduct is saying, well, you know, we can unite it. Since 2007, the EU has made several steps. In 2012, it introduced it to an international community, and since that it had 3 large rounds of consultations, and now there's going to be a big next phase. What is different about this code of conduct? It's currently not discussed as part of the United Nations venue. It's discussed outside, and some countries have a problem with it. Countries like Russia, countries like China, they're saying, well, we've got the UN. Why do you want to discuss space security outside? Well, European countries and US and Japan and Korea and other countries are saying, well, you know, we think that the UN process is too slow. We would like to have some kind of quicker agreements outside the UN venue, and that's what the Code of Conduct is trying to do. But still, it's been slowed down, and there's going to be questions how it's going to work out. So I have another very detailed slide, so I won't go through this, but it promotes a lot of basically things that makes regular sense. You want to reduce damage to spacecraft. You want to mitigate risks of collisions. You want to follow the ITU recommendations on radio spectrum regulation and orbital assignments. You want to follow the space debris mitigation guideline that the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Use of Outer Space adopted. And you want to follow cooperation mechanisms. You want to notify about your activities. You want to make exchanges with your partners on what you're going to do in space. So there are a lot of good things that the Code of Conduct proposes. But there are also lots of criticism of the code, like that it's not in the UN, it's not discussed in the UN. It doesn't cover all other activities. It's not legally binding. But what are the alternatives? Not really comprehensive treaty. So unless somebody's going to come up with a new comprehensive treaty, or somebody's going to say we're going to rewrite the Outer Space Treaty, I think this is the best thing we have today. What is happening now with the Code of Conduct? There's going to be big negotiations in New York in July on the code, and I think the EU wants to finalize this initiative. So I think it will be important in which way it is finalized, because I think this will be one major step toward regulating space activities. So if we look in the future, as I mentioned, there is no single understanding about space security, and it will require a better understanding by everybody, including countries, including commercial players, including private players. What are we talking about when we talk about space security, and what do we want to achieve? And I think everybody achieves that we want to make space safe, secure, and sustainable in the long term. We can all agree on that, but the question, there's different discussions on how to achieve that, and I think that's the major, obstacle today. We also we're living in a world that seems less stable than, let's say, 20 years ago. So what is that going to mean for space? Because most space conflicts, or if there are incidents in space, they're probably going to be connected with terrestrial activities. So we're going to need to understand that better, that link between the terrestrial conflicts and use of space. That's, I think, also something that is now being more discussed than it used to. More actors in space. Today, 60. Well, that's going to be probably more and more. We've got probably 1,200 satellites today. That's going to be much more in near future. So that's going to be a question. Rise of China. I mean, of course, China invests inordinately large amount of money in space. Of course, we've got countries like India, like I mentioned, but China is really developing all range of space activities. And moreover, China is rising as a regional power in a more assertive way than it used to, as vis-a-vis that slide, that picture I showed. So the question, for example, what's going to happen in South and East China Sea? That's definitely going to have implications for space. So the question is how countries are going to deal with that. That brings me to governance. So how are we going to govern space in the future? There's going to be a big discussion leading up to the 2017. We're going to have an anniversary of Outer Space Treaty. I think that people are going to want to come up with new concepts of new proposals of how we can make space activities safer. What they're going to be, that's a question mark. One of them, as I mentioned, is a concept of space traffic management, which is now being tabled. And that's going to be a major part of that discussion. So I think I will summarize here. We have countries that emphasize different capabilities, but space security is important for all of them, and I don't mean only major space powers. I mean developing countries as well. Some of the developing countries procure development of their satellites elsewhere, and some of the countries even have their satellites operated by other countries, but they invest in them and they own them, and they are impacting by space security, because if we are not going to make space viable for activities, that's going to impact also on those countries that are only starting up with these activities. So we've got also more security concerns that we didn't used to have. And how do you deal with all that? How do you deal, with Iran? I mean, Iran is developing, let's say, launch vehicles. They can serve also, they're developing different missiles. Are they going to use it peacefully? That, we don't know. But they have the capabilities of testing these technologies. So how are we going to regulate this? And these are all unanswered questions, and I think there needs to be leadership in this, and I hope that the right kind of leadership is going to prevail in these kind of discussions. I think I will stop here, and I will, I think, open the floor for maybe discussions and questions about any of what I said, but also anything you might be interested in that I didn't cover in my presentation.